maintain that in a truly free society, a person has the right to do whatever they want to their body. This would mean the legalization of all drugs, including drugs like heroin and meth. This position is a little extreme for many people, as the implications of such an immediate legalization could be widespread addiction and death. However, there are arguments that even hard drugs are more harmful to society when they're illegal than when they're legal. In Portugal in the 1990s, hard drug use was one of the country's biggest problems. In 2000, the government shockingly decided the best way to control the problem was, essentially, to decriminalize and regulate all drugs, including marijuana, cocaine, heroin, morphine, and even PCP. Shockingly, the results were that, because of a decreased stigma and fear of jail time, addicts were more likely to go in for rehabilitation. Drug-related deaths dramatically decreased. One of the biggest problems, HIV infections from unclean needles, was reduced by 17%. Both the idea of legalizing all drugs and banning all drugs is too radical for most people. This leads to the question, how do we know which drugs are worthy of being banned?
So what are the qualities in a drug we should look for when determining whether it should be banned? One obvious quality is its lethality. However, it's perfectly legal, although often difficult, to buy poisons such as cyanide and arsenic, so lethality is not the only factor in banning a substance. Addictiveness is also a factor, but many things in our society are also addictive, such as video games, unhealthy foods, and Netflix binge watching. So to look at this issue from some different perspectives, let's examine the various ways of knowing. Faith. Many people, such as those in the temperance movement, have the philosophy that humans are created by God and therefore do not have ownership over their own bodies. This makes drug use an insult to God, which is usually bad. However, drug references can be found in many religious texts, and drugs are used in various religious traditions. Wine is used in communion. In some sects of Hinduism, a cannabis drink is used for certain religious ceremonies, and naturally occurring psychedelic drugs have been used by indigenous people for thousands of years. The Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church even uses marijuana as a sacrament.
I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that there's relative toxicity related to those drugs.
But I'm afraid what's more dangerous and what is more addictive? Cocaine and meth or marijuana? Pretty simple.
I think that conversation minimizes the harm.
No, I'm not trying to minimize the harm. I want to know which is more dangerous and addictive.
Again, I go back as
as
a public health person. One of the things that we look at is not what's the relative risk of one drug.
Okay. Let me just say that I think that your equivocation right there, being unable to answer something clearly and definitively when there is unquestioned evidence to the contrary, is why young people don't believe the propaganda, why they think it's benign. If a professional like you cannot answer clearly that meth is more dangerous than marijuana, which every kid on the street knows, which every parent...
Logic. The logical approach might be to look scientifically at the health effects of each drug before passing legislation on them. Independent researchers in the UK found, based on health effects, societal damage, and addictiveness, that the most harmful drugs are alcohol, heroin, meth, and crack cocaine. This list has some limitations. The data used is from the UK. Drugs are ranked partially by how widespread they are used as opposed to their intrinsic danger, which also may be part of the reason legalized drugs such as alcohol and tobacco are ranked so high. However, this doesn't account for why there seems to be little correlation between a drug's harmfulness and its schedule. Legal drugs, in fact, kill over 5 million people per year, mostly due to tobacco. Of the top 7 drugs ranked most harmful, only heroin is in Schedule 1. Most of the Schedule 1 drugs are ranked comparatively lower in harmfulness, such as marijuana, LSD, and ecstasy.
Many of these drugs that are disproportionately scheduled are psychedelic drugs. As psychedelic drugs were associated with the 60s counterculture, these were the ones that were especially targeted by the government. This method is more of an emotional reaction, as it reflected the fears of not only politicians but much of society. Counterculture is worth addressing because it was strongly disliked by the government for its communist sentiments, which led many officials to believe that the counterculture movement was dangerous. We see another reason why certain drugs are banned. The authority does not like the culture that uses them. Emotion.
People on pot that shoot each other, that stab each other, strangle each other, drive under the influence, kill families, wipe out a whole family. The first time I ever had a pot case.
You sound like you're from the 1930s.
The issue of drugs causes an emotional reaction in many people. This is because many people have had either personal experiences with drugs or have had experiences with people who have felt the effects of drugs. The reaction to these experiences are often strongly positive or negative. Emotion is an especially effective way of convincing people and is used both in PSAs and tobacco and alcohol commercials. Intuition. Possibly part of the reason drug use is more taboo than other, sometimes equally unhealthy activities such as abuse of alcohol and unhealthy foods, is that eating and drinking are both fundamental human functions that we've been doing all our lives. Therefore, it's natural to react negatively to the idea of injecting, snorting, or inhaling substances. Intuitively, these activities seem more harmful, although they may or may not be. The last but most important way of knowing is financial. This may not be on the list of ways of knowing, but in the issue of drug policy, it is certainly the way that many people make their decisions. The origin of marijuana prohibition was quite possibly financial in nature, as it was primarily to eliminate the competition in the paper industry. The fact that tobacco, alcohol, and pharmaceutical companies funded the Partnership for a Drug-Free America suggests that they have something to gain from the system of drug scheduling. The government's financial school of thought is a little less clear. It's true that the alcohol and tobacco industries bring in almost $39 billion annually. However, despite the fact that the medical costs of alcohol and tobacco are over $500 billion, they remain legal. Maintaining the war on drugs costs additional billions, while legalizing and taxing these same drugs could yield high revenues. To try to offset the health effects of tobacco, the government spends millions every year on anti-smoking PSAs. Essentially, the government is simultaneously giving money to tobacco companies and paying for ads to discourage smoking. If we acknowledge that there are certain drugs damaging enough to warrant being banned, then the question becomes, in what way do we implement this and how do we treat offenders? One view states that the goal of drug policy is to protect communities rather than individuals. The individual deserves to be imprisoned because of the threat they pose to the community and the danger that they will spread drug use to other people. The possible implications of this approach is that prisons will become overcrowded and people will be less inclined to seek treatment for fear of imprisonment. The other view states that drug users are not perpetrators of crimes, but victims, if anything, and that in order for the community to improve, they deserve rehabilitation. The possible implications of this approach is that it would send a message of tolerance to the population. In our society, we tend to go by the first way of thinking. The idea that drug users should be punished perhaps comes from an emotional reaction to the state of drug use in America. However, emotion is also the reason people sympathize with drug users and might advocate for treatment rather than punishment. Although many reasons were given by the government regarding the way in which our society bans drugs, when we look deeper into the issue, we have determined that the government seems to have the wrong approach at almost every level of the decision-making process. There is no scientific justification in determining which substances are banned and which are not. What we did find was a mess of bureaucratic dealings that were inefficient and contradictory in nature. These processes were, more often than not, motivated by money or political benefits, and took advantage of the emotions and intuition of the population. Did our biases or opinions change after learning these things? No. In fact, looking into this more led us to believe even more firmly that because our society cannot be consistent with the way it makes things illegal, those decisions must be left up to the individual. If the government is so wishy-washy around the way that drugs have become illegal or are as illegal as they are, then it should be up to the individual to educate themselves and to make the decision of whether to use drugs or not. We are of the opinion that because drugs physically harm only the person using them, it is that person's right and not the right of a third party to use force to stop them or to protect them from themselves.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?